Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I'm here to introduce and welcome Graham Pullen, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Graham is here today to discuss design meets disability. There's a huge potential for innovation in the daily lives of disabled people. Can simple designs avoid the need for complicated accessibility features? Can emerging design methods, such as experience prototyping and critical design, complement clinical trials? When design meets disability, the diversity of complementary, even contradictory approaches can enrich both fields. Graham Pullen is a lecturer in interactive media design at the University of Dundee, Scotland. He has designed everything from mobile phones, hearing aids, furniture for children with disabilities, and remote control submarines. He'll have a lot more to tell us about his incredible work, so please join me in welcoming Graham Pullen to Microsoft to discuss design meets disability.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Now I'm going to try and give audio descriptions of some of the images for Lauren and others this afternoon. But does anyone similarly hearing impaired and would like to follow from a script? Because I've got a spare one here. No? Okay. Okay, so this is one of my favourite things. It's a wonderfully organic and subtle piece of moulded plywood. It's actually not a sculpture. It's not even a piece of furniture. It's a leg splint designed by Charles and Ray Eames for the US Navy for injured service personnel. Now, I don't collect medical design. I cherish it as an object that expresses good design on any terms. And I wonder how many other examples of design for disability might that be said of. Charles Eames believed that design depends largely on constraints. And certainly the new constraints of this brief for the US Navy led the Eames to develop a technique for bending plywood in complex curvature. This was in 1942. Only much later did this find its way into their iconic mainstream furniture. And this is the opposite of the so-called trickle-down effect, where technologies developed for large, wealthy mainstream markets are supposed to eventually find their way down to specialist products for disabled people. The issues around disability can themselves catalyze new design thinking in general. The Eames' journey from leg splints to mainstream furniture was not a direct path, however. Ray Eames began by cutting into spare leg splints with a jigsaw. And I've forgotten to introduce the slides already, haven't I? So here you see a leg splint on the left, and then on the right is a much more complex sculpture in this case. This really is a sculpture where Ray Eames has cut into the splint with a jigsaw to produce a much more complex outline, but with the same material at its heart. This kind of exploration is apparently playful, but with very serious intent from a design point of view. And in the Eames work, these two cultures existed side by side, enriching all their work. Cut to the chase problem solving and more open-ended and playful exploration such as this. Whereas in design for disability, where teams still usually come exclusively from clinical and engineering backgrounds, the dominant culture is one of problem solving. And I think that designers from art school backgrounds could enrich this mix, and that there's a place for playful exploration as well as problem solving. So here's a list of the 7 chapters in the book. The book identifies and explores 7 such tensions that I call initial tensions. And they're cultural differences between some of the priorities that exist at the moment and are taken for granted within design for disability, and some complementary sensibilities from art school design education that could provoke and challenge those. So I'll just read them out. Fashion meets discretion, exploring meets solving, simple meets universal, identity meets ability, provocative meets sensitive, feeling meets testing, and expression meets information. Now, I think these tensions actually do contribute to why the two fields stay apart at the moment. They are deep cultural differences between the educational backgrounds of people in these different fields, and they can lead to misunderstandings and sometimes even skepticism and cynicism about what the other could provide. But I think if we embrace these tensions, they could actually be very creative, and they could open up valuable new directions in the field. Now, I'm a designer, but I'm not a disabled person, at least by the most accepted definitions of that. And so I've been very careful that the opinions about the experience of disability come from conversations with disabled people and their own writings. And many of those people, of course, are also designers. And this is a list of 20 people in the book whose opinions are featured. I notice how diverse these voices are. Even people with the same disabilities can have very markedly different attitudes towards that. And I hope this comes across in both the book and the next half an hour. The tension that the book kicks off with is fashion meets discretion. And I guess this one's received the most press coverage since the book launch. But today I'm going to skip over it because it largely concerns the design of physical objects, whereas the subsequent ones apply equally to interaction design. So I'm figuring there'll probably be more of interest to this audience. But just in passing, I'll just say a few words about this chapter. So the priority in medical engineering has traditionally been to enable whilst attracting as little attention as possible, and that's led to medical devices moulded in flesh-coloured plastic to camouflage them against the skin. And this is what many disabled people wish for, but not all disabled people. And might this also send out a tacit signal that disability is, after all, something to be ashamed of? Now, fashion and discretion are not opposites, of course. Fashion can be understated, and discretion certainly doesn't imply invisibility. But both cannot be the absolute priority at the same time. And the question is whether discretion should always dominate. This is a picture of a very striking and memorable advert from the 1990s for Cutler Gross spectacles. There's a woman wearing a pair of bright red glasses, and she has matching lipstick that's been applied to be dripping from her lower lip. This comes from Cutler Gross, who are one of the companies who've been very influential in glasses' revolution from medical necessity to fashion accessory, from prescribed spectacles to eyewear over the last 30 years or so. And they've achieved this influence by embracing the culture, not just the skills of fashion. They've constantly pushed the boundaries of taste and style. They sometimes describe themselves as the enfant terrible of optometry. And for me, that says it all. And that's why the book is dedicated to Mr. Cutler and Mr. Gross, because I think that design for disability needs a few more enfant terrible. I think that would be very healthy. Now, the frames we're looking at here are incredibly conspicuous, and deliberately so, but they're also beautiful and coordinated and subtle in other ways. So this is definitely not the same as just painting a piece of medical equipment red as a fashion statement, which I've certainly seen done a few times. So what might happen if these sensibilities were applied to other medical products? Again, so now we're looking at a pair of oversized headphones that have a military camouflage paint job on them. This is in fact a concept hearing aid or hearing device by Holger, which formed part of an exhibition called Hearwear at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I like these because they're the antithesis of pink plastic hearing aids, but there's still an ironic reference to camouflage. Now, the point of a work like this is, this is not a solution. This is something that provokes discussion, and that's where its value lies. And the two should not be confused, and I think both have a place. This is an alloy and leather prosthetic hand designed by the French sculptor Jacques Monestier. Now, Monestier worked with a leading prosthetist, but he was also inspired by a 16th century painting of a surgeon fitting an injured soldier with an artificial hand. In Monestier's own words, he wanted to create a beautiful, vibrant, quasi-mythical object, nothing like those dead pink plastic hands that pretend to imitate human flesh. Now, I've spoken to many amputees myself because I designed a prosthetic hand when I was studying at the Royal College of Art. And of course, lots of amputees are very happy and well served by so-called cosmetic hands. And others still are happy not wearing a prosthesis at all. But I've certainly spoken to amputees who wear cosmetic hands, but dread which are very convincing at first, that are not obviously prostheses, but then find themselves dreading reading the moment of realization on the person they've met for the first time's face, when the penny drops and they realize that the hand is not their own. If nothing else, Monestier's hand gets that moment out of the way right at the very beginning. And just finishing this scoot through, obviously very complex issues, so forgive the simplification. We're now looking at a pair of carved wooden legs that were designed by the fashion designer Alexander McQueen and worn on the catwalk by the athlete, actor and model Aimee Mullins. She's got several pairs of legs. She's given amazing talks at the TED conference that some of you might have seen. Oops. But she says that all of her legs are considered unnecessary in terms of medical healthcare provision. But an element of fantasy amongst the practicalities of everyday life is something that's important to her as an individual, even, as she wryly puts it, to be able to express a certain shallowness. So the first principle in the book that comes out of that initial tension is that we could embrace fashion, and in doing so, embrace not just the design skills that come with it, but the culture behind it too. And in fact, maybe you can't have one without the other. Maybe you need to invite them both in together. Now that's a culture that's treated with suspicion by many people working on design for disability, I know. But if we aspire to replicating the revolution in eyewear elsewhere, then maybe we do have to embrace it. Okay, so the next tension is exploring meets solving, and I guess we're coming back now to that tension in the Eames work I was talking about earlier with the two leg splints. Engineering design and medical engineering that has come out of it are traditionally seen as problem-solving disciplines. Design is sometimes problem-solving, sometimes it's more exploratory and open-ended, more playful even, but with serious intent. I think this comes across most clearly if we look at the contrast between chairs and wheelchairs, which you could say were the epitome of each. And we're looking at now at a slide of, I think it's 12 different chairs, produced at the same time in the same collection by the Japanese company Maruni. But they commissioned 12 furniture designers, each to design what they thought to be the archetypal chair for a Japanese market. And they're all very, very different. So chairs continue to proliferate and diversify, and leading to, you can go out and buy a book called 1,000 Chairs in Barnes & Noble. And that's sometimes, I think that's sometimes misinterpreted, because in the design world, a chair is not just a chair, it's also a mechanism for expressing design principles that could equally be applied to other things. It's a standard, and asking, does the world need another chair, is a little bit like asking a jazz musician, does the world need another version of A Night in Tunisia? It's a mechanism for exploring and expressing new points of view. Contrasting that with wheelchairs then, which have definitely literally become the icon of disability in many ways. Wheelchairs have certainly advanced hugely in the last 30 or 40 years, due in no small part to the Veterans Association. We're looking at a very high-tech chair that's designed for playing basketball here. But in doing so, they have tended to also converge towards optimum solutions, which is certainly not what chairs have done. Now, clearly wheelchairs are more complex than dining chairs. They need to be maneuverable and stable and supportive and comfortable. And they've inherited materials and components from aerospace and the military. And they've converged on designs that are coherent and quite bicycle-like these days. But are they really vehicles in the way that bicycles are? Or are they something more than that? This is a chair, this is a bath chair designed around 1900. And if we go back 100 or so years, there's much more commonality between the design of chairs and the design of wheelchairs. The same designers, the same manufacturers are involved. Now, clearly we've gained a lot by the specialism that's come since then, but I think we've also lost some qualities too. Wheelchairs these days tend to be designed from a background in cycle engineering, not furniture design. But what if wheelchairs became a design standard like chairs themselves and were subverted by the most radical of our designers, not just improved by the most technically brilliant? Now, in the book, in the second half of the book, having set up these 7 tensions, I then set up meetings, some imagined and some actual, between particular individual designers who are all very good but very diverse in their approaches and their specializations, and particular briefs in the sphere of design for disability. I won't read them all out, but there's about 17 of them or something. Some of the names you'll recognize, some of them you won't. They come from furniture design, graphics, fashion, as well as the more expected product designers and interaction designers. And the point of these meetings is to anticipate, and I do stress anticipate, what might happen if more art school trained designers were invited in, because I think they need to be invited in to these kinds of projects. Now, all I've done in the book, what I've tried to do is just set up first conversations and trains of thought. So this is more about having a different starting point than getting to a different solution, just to set your expectations. But the different starting points are still striking, and I think they could be inspiring. So when I thought about wheelchairs, I think I realized that in my aspiration for wheelchairs to be more like chairs, there's obviously a dilemma there, because manual wheelchairs at least will continue to need bicycle-like wheels. So how can you move away from a bicycle-like aesthetic for the whole chair without that looking incongruous? And that's why I turned to the designer Michael Marriott, whose work often includes ready-made items from other disciplines that he incorporates into his furniture. So, for example, there's a hat stand, which I don't have illustrated here, that uses wooden kitchen spoons as the detail that you actually hang the hook on. Now, they're recognizable as spoons, but it's not a joke. They're beautifully integrated into a very charming whole. There's another piece, which is a lamp, the stand of which is a weightlifter's weight. Again, it's far more charming than conveying that in words would imply. It's not a gag. It's a beautifully resolved piece of design. So, in Marriott, I thought here might be a designer who could reconcile the fact that it might be a chair with bicycle wheels on, but how could that be expressed charmingly and appropriately, not incongruously? So I confess I was a little bit disappointed at first when he kept dragging the conversation back to bicycles. The thing I hadn't realized about Marriott is he's just as obsessed with bicycles as he is with chairs. And this is a photograph of his studio in London, and he's actually got more bicycles hanging from the rafters, waiting to be repaired and redesigned as he has chairs. In his own words, wheelchairs are midway between chairs and bicycles, my fascinations in life. So I felt like it had all backfired at that point. But then he put together this montage of inspirational material. And I realized I'd been too pessimistic, because this is a montage of lots of interesting bicycle and chair-like projects. But as you look around them, you know, they're in the middle there's Alec Issigonis' sketch of the very first Mini, and Marriott's very inspired by Alex Moulton, who was the suspension designer on that project, who also then designed his own bicycles subsequently. But you know, a couple of pictures along from that, there's Marcel Duchamp with one of his bicycle wheel ready-mades. And so the influences are much broader, and there's some beautifully unexpected ones there, which makes me think that actually Michael Marriott would be a very interesting person to get involved in the design of a wheelchair. Okay, let's turn from physical objects then to something that involves information design, and that's Braille. Now, Braille is increasingly incorporated into the built environment as an accessibility measure. Obviously, not all visually impaired people read Braille, but it's part of making an environment accessible. But at the moment, that's very rarely integrated into designs as a whole. It's too often applied as an afterthought, as an accessibility fix, rather than something that's at the heart of a design in the first place. And actually, so in looking for inspiration of how Braille might be more sensitively and imaginatively incorporated, I've actually looked in the other direction, and I found work, and this is a Braille dress by the artist and professor of fashion in New York, Shelley Fox. Now, in some senses, it's a nonsense, because it's made of wool, and the Braille is 6 inches high, and it's totally illegible as Braille. But Shelley Fox she's obsessed with the aesthetics of Braille, and she's done lots and lots of pieces that explore Braille from different angles. She even sends out invitations to her private views, written exclusively in moonwriting. And for those of you who don't know, moonwriting is another form of tactile text, this time based on abstracted letter forms, and it's designed for people who lose their sight once they've learnt to read visually. Is that right, Lauren?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. So it's very intriguing, because it's totally tactile, but as a sighted person, you can look at it, and after a while, you can begin to decipher it visually. So that's how she gets away with sending this out as invites. Now, this is even further away from Braille. You're now looking at a plate with exquisite tactile details on them. It's designed by the German ceramic artist Bodo Sperlein. And this isn't even inspired by Braille. It's not a reference to Braille. In Sperlein's words, he just wanted to invite people to touch the plates, but also to intrigue them. And yet, I think this could have more to say about how Braille might be beautifully incorporated into products and environments than any number of stainless steel or plastic plates screwed to doors or walls in our museums and galleries at the moment. Should, after all, the highest aspiration be that Braille not detract from an environment, or could it actually enhance it? By doing so, actually enhance the experience of sighted people, not just Braille readers themselves. So that leads us to the second of our substantive meetings with designers. I went to talk to Graphic Thought Facility, who are a very respected graphic design company in London, about Braille. The reason I approached them was that they do a lot of work in museums and galleries. They do a lot of signage, but they also do work that's quite physical. It involves interesting physical production techniques. This is a set of boxes they devised where you punch out the little circles to make labels, and the cardboard that they're made of is folded back on itself with the highlight colour showing through from the far side. This here is a perforated page of a book they designed for the Dutch designer Tour Boontier, and it's perforated in reference to the designer's own work that often involves perforated steel. So it has beautiful tactile qualities and something of the scale and detail of Braille. Now, when I went to speak to Graphic Thought Facility, again, I had another surprise, I suppose you could say. In that they have lots of samples of stuff all around their studio. And we got a quarter of an hour into the conversation, they reached down and they had a big box full of Braille samples and tactile maps from the RNIB and all kinds of things like that, because it absolutely fascinated them. But they said that they'd never got the chance to do any Braille because it was never part of their project. It was always a separate accessibility project that a separate team would do. And so, the conversation, they were very, I think that had eventually got to them because they were very modest that they had anything to say about Braille at all. And whether that was the reinforcement of that always being a separate issue or not, I don't really know. So we started talking, and then the second set of materials that they reached for were these ceramic tiles by the artist Lubna Chowdhury. And they'd commissioned Chowdhury to design these for an advertising campaign they'd done for Nokia. So they look like targets each, but every one of them is very different in colour and texture. And they started arranging these on the desk as we spoke, and they started to imagine what it might be like if they blew up Braille and used it at a very large scale along an entire wall in a museum. Now clearly, again, we're back to the dress in a way. I mean, this makes no sense in terms of legible Braille, and the Braille itself would then be carried as a non-scaled texture on these ceramic tiles themselves. But it suddenly starts setting up very intriguing relationships between the Braille and the environment and the visible text. And they started thinking how much extra space they'd then have to incorporate Braille onto this and what content they could then provide. Would there actually be more Braille than visible text in this environment? And actually, come to think of it, where would we put the visible text? And I think that was a nice point to leave the conversation, because how refreshing to be thinking about Braille first and then trying to retrofit the visible text onto it for a change. There's a question here.
I was just wondering if the different colors of the Braille dots feel different, so someone could go up and feel it different?
That was the idea, that some of them would be rough and some of them would be smooth, and the smooth ones would carry the readable Braille, and the rough ones would be there as tactile decoration, if I can put it that way. Yeah, but I mean, I stress this is a first conversation, and they were very clear that they found it really inspiring and intriguing, but they'd want a real brief to take it any further. It would be meaningless to take this any further without a real brief and without the involvement of visually impaired people. But just to have that opportunity would be a good thing, and it's nothing that they've had so far in their careers. Okay, so having talked about universal design, as you call it here in the States, for a bit, I just want to now change, because obviously the design for disability encompasses both design for special needs and universal design. So let's turn instead to a particular area of design for disability, and that's communication aids for people who can't speak. And the tension I'm going to look at here, the name of the chapter is Expression Meets Information. Now, oops, I've gone too far forward. So, in terms of designing communication aids for people who can't speak, and it's where my own design research is cited at the moment. And if there's time at the end, I'd love to show you an example of that that's nothing to do with the book. But it would be great to make some connections with people here who might be working in a similar area. But traditionally, communication aids have been seen as a technical quest for natural, so-called natural or unambiguous speech. And I must say, as an interaction designer, this reminds me a little bit of flesh-coloured prostheses. It seems analogous. And so as an interaction designer, it's not that I want to dismiss that approach, but I'm interested in alternatives. I'm interested in what happens if you don't go for transparent interactions with speech. You actually go for more expressive, overt interactions instead. Because communication is not just information after all, but it's also expression and self-expression. They're inseparable. Now, many communication devices today use text-to-speech technology. And so people like Stephen Hawking can select any word they want, but it's only through full stops and question marks and exclamation marks that he has any control over the way that those words are spoken by the technology. Whereas in everyday speech, we're all using way more nuanced tone of voice than that. And here's a picture going back to 1936 of the phonetician Daniel Jones' transcriptions of different ways of saying yes, and the nuance, often quite culturally loaded nuance of meanings of each one. Now, a lack of tone of voice in communication aids is unfortunate for two reasons. I mean, the obvious reason is that sentences can get misunderstood in the same way that emails can get misunderstood. But it goes deeper than that, because over the course of a conversation, a lack of variation of tone of voice, a lack of nuance, can actually lead people to think that the person they're talking to is socially inept or even emotionally impaired. Both these effects have been identified by other researchers. In the words of Eric Spiekermann, the graphic designer, you cannot not communicate. There is no such thing as a totally neutral tone of voice. Certainly not in speech, anyway. I started to get interested in this field when I was working at IDEO on a project called Social Mobiles, which took a critical and satirical look at the etiquette of using cell phones in public spaces and the disruption and anger that can cause. And the speaking mobile, I won't go into that project now, but the speaking mobile addressed that problem, if I can say that, by letting someone speak with their hands, not their mouth, and to shape the sound of words like yes and no, where the meaning is so tied up with the intonation, using a joystick. At Dundee, I'm exploring and designing much wider possibilities, and as I say, I'll show you those at the end if we do find that there's time. One really inspiring example in this field is the Tango, which is a communication aid seen here. Now, you see here Richard Ellenson, who's an advertising executive in New York, with his son Thomas, who happens to have cerebral palsy, and the communication aid that Richard set up a company to design for Thomas, but also for other children who have complex communication needs. Now, what's interesting here and exemplary is that Ellenson approached this project much in the way that he'd have approached a major ad campaign. So he didn't try and do it all himself, and he didn't even try and set up a company that would do it all themselves. He approached all kinds of different experts in all kinds of different fields and got them to bring what they did best to the mix, whether or not they'd had any previous involvement with AAC. So of course he involved speech and language professionals and speech technologists, but he also involved industrial designers and interaction designers, and he even went so far as to involve the Nickelodeon Cartoon Network to develop voices and cartoon characters for the interface. And so what came about is something that's far more appropriate to Thomas and his needs. And so Thomas now, with his Tango communication aid, has an appropriate way of expressing himself through tone of voice. He can choose to speak his words, but he can also choose to yell, whisper, or whine them. And I think that's a nice choice of four for a 7-year-old New Yorker. In fact, Ellenson's a bit frustrated in being a Jewish New Yorker himself. He wants to expand on the whine and include moan and complain, and I think the list is longer than that. Here's another inspiring project. This is the badge that Joanna Van Dalen, who's a designer, and Samir Shaban, who you see here in her wheelchair, created together. Now, Samir normally uses a communication book and points to words, and that's very, very flexible, but it's also quite long-winded. And so when they got together to co-design this product, because it came from both of them equally, Samir decided that she'd actually like a badge to let her express frustration more spontaneously. So she wears a badge that says Samir, which is, I guess, a sensible badge to have in the first place. But when she presses the head switch to the right of her head, the badge says, Samir says, sod off. in capital letters. Now, I love this because, obviously it's very direct information, but it says so much more. It's so much more than an utterance, isn't it? It's a statement about who Samia is. And what's nice, the very fact that she'd dedicate an entire switch to saying sod off. I think that's really putting your money where your mouth is. But it's a badge of her own devising. It's not a badge that comes from any stereotype in anyone else's mind. So that makes it very refreshing. So one of the meetings with designers in this area is with a young interaction designer called Andrew Cook, who happens to also be a computer musician. And he's a very good computer musician, but he also finds it very frustrating because when he's on stage creating music from his laptop, it's very difficult to establish a rapport with an audience because they're not quite sure whether they're listening to pre-recorded music or whether he's doing something very skillful in real time or whether he's actually just sitting there doing his email. And, and I have the same worry about some of you in the audience at the moment, so I can kind of relate to what he's saying. I think there's a lesson there for communication aids as well. I've said that text-to-speech technology is at their heart, and I think sometimes they get conceived as computers because of that. And a lot of the assumptions of how we like to interact with our own personal computers are taken through to communication aids. And sometimes that's appropriate, and sometimes it may not be quite so appropriate. One of the projects Cook has done is he's designed a kit called Tectonics, which tries to get round the issues that I was talking about a minute ago by letting a musician wire up any physical object to make it the interface through which they control machine-produced sound. It's not about the sound of the object, it's about using it as a control interface. And here we've got a photograph of a musician in his 60s who's wired up a tree branch in this way and is giving a musical performance that involves bending the branches, scratching the bark off, snapping twigs off the branches. Now, as a musician, he says that it's very interesting because it's very intuitive, and you bring a lot of wisdom or knowledge of how you will interact with materials and what sounds they'll make with you to an interface that's so physical and so based on materials. But it's also intriguing and inspiring to watch a performance given on it, because it's the cause and effect is very visible. So in my conversation with Andrew Cook, we started talking about whether materials could be quite an interesting route into how on earth a layperson would grapple with the nuances of tone of voice. Is there anything about our expectations and experience of materials that would allow you to access tones of voice that may be very difficult to describe in words? And I think the point that this leads me, that all these examples lead me to, is that I think when it comes to communication aids, I think there's an issue of considering aesthetics in the broadest sense. The design of communication aids, it includes the way they sound, it includes the way they feel and the way they look, and all these things send out messages, as with so many other things. And so all those aspects should be considered as part of the whole. How are we doing for time?
Good.
Okay, I've got 2 more chapters to take you through, but should we just do the next one and see where we are, and you can then decide whether we... Yeah, okay. So, so the next chapter I've entitled Simple Meets Universal. And so this is returning back to what you call universal design here in the States and what we tend to call inclusive design in the UK. Now, those terms both suggest a certain comprehensiveness. And I'd just like to touch on the role that narrowness or restraint might have in achieving the same goal, in achieving accessibility. Now, I should say a few words about the images I'm going to show here. I want to assure you this isn't about Apple versus Microsoft. I just happen to have an image of an iPod Shuffle on the screen at the moment. But it certainly is about some of the distinctions between platforms and appliances. And so this is a picture of the Apple iPhone as a stand-in for a whole host of similar devices. Because talk of inclusive design does tend to get you into the space of platforms quite easily. Surely the more a product can do for more people, the more inclusive you could say it was. And even when designing for special needs, so to flip back to the other side, there's often an enormous pressure to be universal within a market, and so not fragment already a small population. But this is one example. This is a piece of furniture. It's support furniture designed by James Leckie in Belfast for children with cerebral palsy, and Leckie has quite deliberately moved away from even aspiring to universal solutions, which is a significant move given the range of sizes and clinical conditions that his furniture has to encompass. So instead, he's gone right back to the beginning and reconceived his entire manufacturing to offer flexibility through more bespoke designs. And the reason he's done that, in his own words, is he's trying to avoid the flying submarine. That's the word he always uses in meetings if he's trying to slap down something that's getting a little bit too reconfigurable and modular. And by flying submarine, he means a concept that's so overburdened with features, it's going to be condemned to mediocrity in each of those features. And that's important in his business because I guess you could say that the highest goal of the furniture he makes, or one of the highest goals, is to let severely disabled children attend mainstream schools and integrate with their non-disabled peers. Now, if that furniture, in its complexity and its adjustability, is so intimidating and unapproachable and stigmatizing that it actually is a social barrier between the children, then it's kind of undermined its own purpose in the first place. And that's why he takes the issue of simplicity and approachability so seriously. Now, products and applications do have a habit of becoming more complex with successive generations as more features are added. And obviously, sometimes accessibility features can themselves contribute to this, as maybe multiple modes are added to render something accessible from different with different senses. And I guess the danger is that can then render something sensorially accessible in principle, but actually too confusing to configure and introduce a secondary cognitive or cultural exclusion, which I think we'd all, well, I'd confess that is the aspect of exclusion least understood by designers and engineers. But should products always get more complicated from the user's point of view as they develop? And the slide, is a picture of the Shuffle having evolved from the iPod in the first place. Now, here's one example where that's absolutely key to the whole proposition. It's a simple radio designed by the Bath Institute of Medical Engineering, who are a wonderful outfit in England. They have a very rigorous iterative user-centered design process, and this is part of a program of designing products and also environments for people with dementia. And so what you're looking at here is a radio that's been simplified functionally. It just has an on-off button, and all the other controls are hidden away. But it has a big red band around the front of it, and then it has the word radio written very largely on the front face. Now, I think designers could actually be really inspired to explore whether the form of a radio could communicate that something was a radio as clearly as the text is doing in this example. And certainly if they were able to do that, I think that could have enormous mainstream appeal as well. So that could lead to a different solution. There's also evidence uncovered by Aimee themselves that people with dementia have heightened emotional and aesthetic responses to the objects and the environments around them. So arguably, design quality is still really important to people with dementia, perhaps even more important than it is to the rest of us. So I'm going to finish with this. This is a CD player designed by Naoto Fukasawa for the Japanese manufacturer Muji. It alludes to a traditional ventilation fan. It's a square box on the wall. There's a CD-sized recess in the middle of it. And when you place the CD on the spindle in its center to face you, all that's left is a pull cord hanging down with a little piece of plastic on the bottom like you get on a light pull switch or a ventilation fan switch. That makes it pretty obvious to know how to switch the thing on and set the CD spinning and the music playing. And it's quite obvious how to stop it again afterwards. It's capitalizing on a rich cultural tradition that we have that is about. It's not about experience just with this product. It's bringing in experiences we may have had beforehand. Now, this simplicity comes at a cost. There is no display on this CD player. You don't know what the name of the track you're listening to is. You don't know how long the track's going to last or how many minutes are left, etc., etc. Nevertheless, the features that are lost are outweighed by a delightful overall experience, and certainly the whole exceeds the sum of the parts. So I think sometimes it would be good to aspire to a lightness of touch in this area, because good design often requires the courage to value simplicity over being all things to all people. Now, of course, I realise there's a nice, healthy tension here between this and many definitions of universal design, so that's not straightforward. But I think it's a tension to welcome in and to wrestle with and to see what happens. Getting designers involved at the brief writing stage is how that would happen. Because good designers, I think, develop a field for the difference between the user's experience in theory and in practice. Okay, I've got one more chapter. Do you want me to keep going, or shall I stop for questions, or how are you feeling? One more. Okay, so the last chapter I'll cover this afternoon, and again, forgive me, these are all so brief, and I hope they don't come across as being glib as a result of that brevity, is called Identity Meets Ability. And I guess it's good to return to this because in terms of the word glib, because it goes back to some of the territory that we saw with hearing aids and unpicks that a bit further, because obviously it's not quite as simple as designing beautiful earpieces. When the focus is on disability, even in whether that's in inclusive design or design for special needs, markets are often then defined in terms of abilities or ranges of abilities. But non-disabled markets aren't defined in that way at all. They're subdivided in terms of attitudes and tastes and priorities. So it would be good to layer those distinctions on top of markets that involve disability in some way. One illustration of that, and here's pictures of some earbuds with little copper coils in them, and I'll explain what they're all about in a couple of slides' time. When I was a designer at IDEO, at the design consultancy, I led a team who were responding to the same R&ID project that you saw the camouflage ear cans coming out of. The project was called HearWare. Now, we started off by interviewing some hard of hearing people, and one of them, Anthony, we were talking to him, and he said, yes, but of course I'm deaf with a capital D. And we assumed he meant very deaf indeed. We assumed he meant profoundly deaf, because he had 2 hearing aids and we were talking to him through an interpreter as well. But when he used the same phrase, deaf with a capital D, a second time, we thought we'd better ask what he meant by that, because it clearly was more significant. And he explained to us that for him, his deafness is a large part of his cultural identity in a very positive way. And he makes the distinction between him being deaf with a capital D with people that he describes as deaf with a little d, for whom their deafness is really more of a source of social isolation. And I guess there's that latter group, who may not even be aware of the distinction themselves, are probably where most of us would end up if we lost our hearing later in life. But for him, he's deaf with a capital D, and that's a very different place to be. So I guess it was appropriate that when we were doing the project, we then actually found ourselves coming up with two completely different concepts, one inspired by a conversation with Anthony and his attitude to his deafness, and one being inspired by a conversation with Jamie, who we realised in hindsight must have been deaf with a little d, although he didn't express that because that wasn't the way he thought of himself. So the concept we came up with for Jamie was more about his exclusion in social places when mixing with most of his friends who were hearing. And he said that he found that in a crowded bar, when there were lots of people around a table having a conversation, he's a very skilled lip reader. And he's got, he gets a lot from his hearing aids as well, but there's a lot of background noise in a bar. And his trouble is if a conversation is lively and it's changing hands very quickly from one person to another, and he's moving around the table visually trying to catch who's speaking next, he usually misses the first couple of words on someone's lips when the conversation changes. And so, in his words, he's always playing catch-up, trying to infer what they must have started off saying by what they say next. And he said that can get really difficult, and it can actually lead to a reluctance to engage in those atmospheres. So we came up with just a concept, but we came up with a table with that you can see a detail of here. It's a piece of mahogany with a piece of copper laid into it that overtly has induction coils in the surface of the table. So it's very, very low tech. It's the kind of thing that has been in bank telling windows and theatres for many years. But it makes this overt and part of the design of the table itself. And in this way, in combination with microphones placed around the table itself, Jamie would be able to tune in with the T setting on his hearing aid to a more filtered conversation that's going around the table with less of the background noise coming in, and therefore get more from his hearing aids to augment his lip reading. When we'd done that, we realised that actually a lot of us suffer from this same predicament. We go to bars because they have a raucous atmosphere, and that's what attracts us to them in the first place. But then it's actually quite difficult to discriminate, especially if you're getting to even, my age, the foreground speech from the background noise. And so we thought maybe we should design some disposable earpieces so that the rest of us could catch up, that we could maybe buy in blister packs from the bar. And I don't know, we just liked the way that was turning inclusive design on its head in a way, creating an environment that put a hearing aid wearer at an unfair advantage. And then the rest of us catch up. I think that reminds me, as a bit of an aside, going back to Aimee Mullins, one of my favourite anecdotes of hers is when she turned up at a party with a particularly glamorous pair of legs on, and one of her friends said, "Oh, Aimee, that's not fair." So I think what I'm inspired to do in this field is to at the same time blur some boundaries but sharpen some focus. So what I mean by that is look at the overlaps between some people with a particular disability and some people without, maybe in particular circumstances. So certainly not universal design. It's not designed for the whole population, but nonetheless it's quite targeted design that nonetheless cuts across more traditional boundaries of mainstream design versus design for disability. And for want of a better phrase, I've started calling that resonant design in the book, because there's some kind of resonance normally at the heart of that makes that a natural marriage and makes that mutually exclusive or mutually beneficial or mutually exploitative, depending on which way you look at it, for both groups. So continuing on the theme of, I guess, resonant design, this is a watch designed by the Swiss manufacturer Tissot. It's it's entirely tactile, so you can tell the time with your hands, but for a sighted wearer, its main feature of interest is a tactile alarm. Tissot market this as a discrete alarm for any wearer, and of course, in selling it across a non-disabled as well as a disabled market, they have to achieve the same design and production standards that are expected in a mainstream market. And this is what makes it very different to a lot of watches for visually impaired people. I also think there could be some interesting, more radical exploration in the area of watches for visually impaired people. Lauren, I should explain that everyone's spluttered because this is a watch designed by Crispin Jones, who is an artist and designer who does quite critical pieces on the design of many objects, and he's produced a series called Mr. Jones watches, which start to challenge the idea that a watch should always be a status symbol, and he asks what would happen if a watch were there to inspire humility in its wearer. And this is a watch called the Humility Watch. And just before it tells you the time, it flashes up the motto, "Remember you will die." Now, so Crispin and I worked on a watch that we called the Discretion Watch, and again we were looking at a resonance between visually impaired and sighted people, and recognizing the fact that often the times when we're most bored, and actually this might be true of some of you in this room right now, are actually the most awkward times to be seen to be looking at your watch. And so we thought it would be quite valuable to design a watch that you could not only read the time without looking, but you could read the time without being seen to look. So I had a conversation with, I had a further conversation with Crispin Jones in the book about watches for visually impaired people, and the train of thought. Again, I just want to stress these are just trains of thought that Crispin got onto was the fact that we choose the watches we wear for all kinds of reasons other than practical. Now Seiko, who would say this, wouldn't they, claim that it's your watch that says most about who you are. Now that's a bit unfortunate in the case of there's one RNIB vibrating watch that isn't actually worn on the wrist at all. It's worn on the belt, and it looks like a smoke detector. So I'm a bit concerned about what signals that sends out. So what would it mean to embrace the cultural role of a watch for visually impaired people as well as the functional? And the aspect of time telling that Crispin then started getting intrigued by was accuracy. You know, how often do we all of us have watches that tell the time with different accuracies, and that's not necessarily to do with how accurately we actually need to tell the time. And it's not even, I mean, whatever Seiko say, it's not necessarily about projecting our personality, but it might be about how we feel about the time and how we relate to it. And so what Crispin does in a series of diagrams is he takes as his starting point the notion of an audible watch with abstract sounds rather than a speaking watch, an audible watch. But he then starts unpicking that in terms of how accurately that might tell the time, and how that, you know, how comfortable visually impaired people with different personalities might feel about that degree of accuracy. Just as the rest of us, some of us have watches with no numerals at all, and some of us have watches which tell the time to thousandth of a second. So I'm going to finish off with one last meeting, and we'll go back to a physical object now, I'm afraid. This is a meeting between Tomoko Azumi, the Japanese furniture designer, and Step Stools. The piece we're looking at here is her degree piece, which is called Table Equal Chest. And it's it's either a 3-drawer chest or it's a coffee table. It folds from one to the other. But the thing about it, and the thing that's so wonderful about it, is that in each of those configurations, it's totally resolved. It doesn't look like a folding chest or a folding table. It wears its ingenuity so lightly. That's the impressive thing about it. And then, of course, that makes the unexpected transformation all the more delightful. Now, and that's why I thought that Tomoko would be interesting to talk about step stools. And this is Sandy Marshall, and she has restricted growth as a result of a condition called achondroplasia. And she recently wrote an article in the Guardian newspaper in Britain that was entitled "I am 4 foot 2 inches," and it talked about a lot of things, but included in that it talked about the problems she has with the built environment and not being able to reach light switches and lift buttons and things that she's had changed in her own home but are still inaccessible. And so a pragmatic thing to do is to carry around a set of portable steps, and until the environment changes. Now, one of her colleagues at the Restricted Growth Association, Michael Sharmash, I was speaking to him, and he said he had a medical set of steps, but he always felt uncomfortable carrying them around because they were rather ugly. And so he went into a furniture shop in the West End of London and bought what he described as a designerly set of steps, which he says are not fit for purpose at all, really, but he lives with them because he just feels more comfortable being seen with them. So what would happen if someone like Tomoko Azumi was involved in that brief with a manufacturer, with people like Sandy and Michael? Now, obviously, a step stool is an incredibly challenging and quite traditional engineering brief. It's a very demanding brief. It has to be stable and lightweight, and it has to fold and be portable. And those things in themselves are so challenging they can easily dominate the whole activity. Whereas Tomoko, as you see here in this picture of a few bookshelves in her studio, I guess the way that she works is more akin to a sculptor. She works with maquettes. She makes little physical models of the furniture that she produces, and that's the way she feels herself into a problem. When I spoke to Tomoko, it was very interesting. She ended up coming up with 2 qualities. I hesitate to call them features, but 2 qualities that a step stool might have that I'd never heard before. And she described them as a little cough and a little lift. And I'll tell you what she means by that. So a little cough was when, say in a crowded bar, where you're deploying a set of steps to actually gain eye contact with the bartender would be a really good thing to do. Before you can do that, you need to negotiate a bit of space to deploy a set of steps. And so something about the way they unfold should attract enough attention to give you that space, but not so much that the whole bar ends up staring at you. So that's what Tomoko means by a little cough. And then when she says a little lift, she means that, however beautifully designed, a step stool is going to be a pain to carry around. It's going to be a real inconvenience. And so somehow, each time it's deployed, giving something back, there being a little bit of delight for the person using it, giving them an emotional as well as a physical lift, is not an inappropriate thing to ask of a design. It reminds me of the CD player that Naoto designed. So a little cough and a little lift. I think they're wonderful things to have on a design brief for a set of steps. Okay, so just to finish up, I just want to make this clear in case this hasn't come across. I'm in challenging some of the traditional priorities of design for disability. I'm certainly not meaning to dismiss their importance. Certainly not. Both fashion and discretion are necessary influences. Exploring and solving are important. Ability and identity, provocation and sensitivity, that they're all important in the mix. It's going to require designers and engineers and disabled people and therapists, like opposing muscles, I sometimes think, playing off each other and acting together. And the point I'm just making is there's one group that are kind of conspicuous by their absence at the moment, and that's art school trained designers. So that's why I'm advocating that more of them are invited in to this amazing field. And I hope it comes across as well that it's an amoral book. I'm not trying to make a moral argument for that happening. I just think it would, that aside, it would enrich and change design in itself in ways that would be rewarding for their own sake, quite apart from any personal feelings that the designers involved would have. The book's intended to be catalytic, and I hope that very soon the ideas within it will be better represented by exemplars rather than in writing, because I think that's it's design that inspires design most efficiently and most imaginatively. But when design does meet disability, I firmly believe that this meeting will change design itself. Thank you for listening. I'm open to any questions, and I've also got a short video of the work I'm doing with speech technology, but maybe we should leave that to the end for anyone who want to stay behind for that.
Question? Do you know of any companies that are making, on a big scale, that are making products, mainstream products, but have they really do include people of all abilities and things like challenges in the product?
Okay, so I think I probably should mention the example that's conspicuous by its absence in the book, because this question has come up before, like, why aren't the OXO good grips in the book? And so I think that's an example of what you're talking about. The reason I haven't mentioned them today, the reason they're not in the book is, one is I feel they're very, very well known, and they've been around a long time. There's a very well understood story of Sam Farber and his wife, who has arthritis, being the inspiration for the design of those products that now have a mainstream appeal. But I think the reason I left them out was that good grips, the emphasis is so much on the ergonomics, and I think that's something that's I think that's very well understood at the moment, that ergonomics is key to inclusive design. And so I took the decision to leave them out, because I think there's lots of other qualities that aren't in the mix at the moment, and I wanted to give them a chance to be communicated instead.
So I just wondered if there was Target or somebody that's actually designing things that is adding a bunch of voices to the table before the designs that Yeah,
I mean, design processes are getting more and more inclusive in that sense. I think that's an interesting effect in itself, that the word inclusive design is used in two different ways. It's either used to mean designing for a wider population, or it's used to also describe something that isn't distinct from that, but involving disabled people and people who are diverse in other ways in the design process itself. I guess the one thing that I would say is that it's really important to keep the design in inclusive design, because the thing that worries me is if design is accessible but mediocre, it kind of becomes design for special needs by default, because only the people who need to use it end up using it. And and I think that's why I'm not ashamed to say that designers should be in that mix as well, and often they are conspicuous by their absence, even when people with disabilities aren't, which is and we need both, and engineers and social scientists and clinicians. Lauren.
I think one of the, this is more of a comment, I guess, but I think one of the things you're seeing, if you know anything about obviously you do, I mean you and general audience, about technology for blind and low vision folks, that for example, for years they had specialized what were called note takers. And they were these big brick-looking things that you'd have to carry around that were portable, sure, but they weren't very stylistic. But now you kind of see those slowly going away because people are able to, because of advances in software and things like that, they're able to put screen readers and Bluetooth and things like that onto their cell phones, which they can just buy a mainstream cell phone and have GPS and have note-taking ability on it with a a fold-up keyboard or with just a standard texting 12-key phone pad, things like that. So it's kind of melding those two things together, as you were saying. And then it's just, for example, when you look at wheelchair ramps, who uses wheelchair ramps most? People in wheelchairs, or is it people with groceries, or mothers with strollers, or whatever? Who uses closed captioning? Is it deaf people, or is it people in health clubs or sports bars, right? It's being able to strategically think about, if we make this way, who's going to benefit? Is it just this quote-unquote small population, or is it more of the whole world, the whole universal issue?
An example of what he's just saying there is, if you're familiar with universal design for learning, which is an attempt to take this kind of philosophy and apply it to learning, and individualized learning and specialized learning. David Rose out at Harvard has pioneered this, and it became the law last year that people have to be able to choose the way they learn and the way they express their knowledge. And what he said is that designing for those edge cases, the very low frequency, and people that have unique abilities or disabilities, it really empowers the entire audience, and he thinks it's going to be much more powerful for the entire learning population. And so I think that's a common trend, that designing for these lead users who happen to have some unique challenges or constraints inspires a design that's very powerful for the wide audiences. And we've seen that in a number of places.
I think a lot of design groups out there focus on what they sometimes call extreme users, don't they? And rather than focusing on the stereotype in the middle.
There's a whole methodology around lead user research and design to really does that.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Anushka. I work in the accessibility group with a couple of people that are here. And one of our challenges is educating people around Microsoft on accessible technology, what they need to do with their own design and products to become accessible. And I was wondering your thoughts on how do you help people put themselves in the mindset of these users. So with somebody who's not disabled in any way, for them to then think about how their product is used by people that are very different with their abilities than themselves. That seems to be a hurdle that we have to get over. So are there
leaps
or design philosophies that help people get into the mode for that?
I'm an interaction designer more than I'm a human factor specialist. But I've worked with lots of people who are human factor specialists. But I don't know. I think there's a sense in which the best way is not to even try and do that, but actually get some people involved who are in that group. I mean, we're back to the issue of inclusive design in the other sense. I think it depends as well. I mean, it's one thing to put on some gloves and imagine what it might be to have reduced dexterity. It's quite another to try and think yourself into the experience of dementia, or language impairment. So I think, I'm a firm believer in both of these things, to involve people with disabilities themselves as individuals, not as populations, and to bring with them all their idiosyncrasies as individuals, not to try and get one person to represent an entire group, but also to involve the very best designers at the same time, and not imagine that one is a substitute for the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And with the designers that you talked with for this project, how did they have any insight into that, about how they would go about designing for this population? Like one of our sayings that we have here is like, well, we're not designing our software for ourselves or for our people here who work at Microsoft. So we are trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes, but it just seems to be especially challenging?
I mean, I think the focus of the book is probably something less ambitious than you're suggesting, if I understand you correctly. I mean, I'm not looking forward to my initial concern is not that a talented designer might think, I'm going to start designing and manufacturing prostheses. How do I go about that? It's more that there are huge activities in design for disability at the moment going on in institutions and companies, and I think the more modest step that I'm looking for is to get those existing teams to invite the very best art school trained designers into their teams. Sometimes to integrate, sometimes to kick things up a bit, and so that in-house skill of how to design for people in those groups, they'll have so much more expertise and history in that. I think the irony is once those people are in the teams, they will bring complementary insights that could lead to all kinds of interesting new directions at very fundamental levels as well as at detailed levels. But we won't know until that happens. And I think the ball is in the court of people working on these projects at the moment. And again, I just want to make that the book is not. I hope the book doesn't come across as being sanctimonious in the sense that I'm not waggling a finger at designers and saying you need to get more involved in disability. That's not what this book's about. But at the moment they're not being invited into those projects to contribute their skills.
I think related to that, just on an organizational level, we should really be seeing the benefit to the corporation in terms of hiring in people, being more inclusive in terms of our hiring and our management practices, in terms of people who have disabilities, for example, flex their problem-solving muscles every single day. So they bring in a benefit to a team that is quantifiable regardless of everything else that they have to offer, right? So I think just in general, when you say bring in people who have disabilities, not just consult with them and ask them about their experiences, but hire people.
Yeah, have them in the design team.
People,
Absolutely, totally agree.
Because they will help you solve problems that relate both to accessibility, but also just general business solving. Because they have to solve problems every second of every day, and so they bring in that strength that we might not have because we get lazy because things are easy. So I think both as a user interface, but also as a business interface, it's that inclusion of those perspectives valuable.
Any more comments?
Lauren, did you want to say something else?
Well, Lauren, was that you that made the comment?
That was me.
Oh, okay. Well, you know that we are actually, that's kind of my job. So we're definitely hiring people with disabilities, and we definitely utilize our employee resource groups or diversity advisory councils when it comes to increasing our basically our testing matrices, if you will, internally. But yeah, I mean, we're always looking at efforts. In fact, that's one of my jobs. Is what I'm trying to do is to just inspire and motivate other groups around that area, getting staffing more involved on a systemic level and things like that. So we're definitely moving in the right direction, and we are very well respected. We have quite the diverse disability population here at Microsoft. There's quite a few people that are actually in this building that are in MS research with disabilities. I can think of two right off the top of my head. So, yeah.
Well, I'm thinking that maybe since all of you have books that you probably have Graham sign, we should do that, and then those of you who want to stay and see the continuing project. Will that work? Can we do that?
Anything works for me.
So let me get you a pen. We've got some Sharpie right here. Why don't we just come up here and get your book signed if you'd like to, and then we'll sit back down and watch the rest.
Oh, did you?
You're not going to film this bit, I take it?
The book signing, no.
I can take this off now.
You can take that off.
Is there